6 murders. One man found guilty. You might think, oh, another open and shut case, right?
Mm.
But what if I told you this story? It cracks open this whole conversation about bias, about justice, and about the really troubling realities for marginalized communities in South Africa.
Yeah.
This one, it really hit my radar, this story, in a recent article. It's from IOL News.
Okay.
And the title, pretty straightforward, Sifiso Mkhwanazi, sentenced to life for murdering 6 Zimbabwean sex workers in Joburg. But there's a lot more here, a lot more that meets the eye, trust me.
Yeah.
And that's why we're doing a deep dive today. Because, behind these headlines, you have 6 women whose stories we don't often hear, whose lives and deaths often get lost. So we're here to shed some light on this case and hopefully uncover some uncomfortable truths about the systemic issues that might have contributed to this tragedy.
Right.
And I am joined today by an expert who brings years of experience understanding the complexities of these kinds of cases, especially within South Africa.
Yeah, it's a privilege to be here, and I think you're right. I think this case really highlights some really deep-seated issues that South Africa is grappling with.
Yeah. So before we get into the details of the case itself, can you give us some background? The article mentions that the victims were Zimbabwean sex workers.
Right.
What's the social and legal climate like for those communities in South Africa?
Yeah, you're touching on a really critical aspect here, and that is that sex work in South Africa exists in this kind of legal gray area. It's not fully decriminalized.
Which essentially forces it underground and makes it far more dangerous for everyone involved. And that lack of legal protection, it creates this breeding ground for exploitation, for violence. It traps these women in a system that really offers them very little recourse. And tragically, the stigma that surrounds their profession often prevents them from even seeking help or seeking justice when they need it most.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it?
It is.
That they're trapped in a system that seems designed to fail them. And you mentioned that the victims were Zimbabwean.
Right.
What's the dynamic like between South Africa and Zimbabwe? Could that have played a role in this story at all? Absolutely. And, there's a long history of migration between the two countries. A lot of Zimbabweans, seeking better economic opportunities in South Africa. But this migration has, at times, fueled tensions and, sadly, even xenophobia. And this can manifest in discrimination, in prejudice, and in the most extreme cases, in violence against immigrants.
Yeah, it's like this undercurrent of tension that becomes part of the backdrop of this story, even if we don't see it explicitly in the headlines.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's turn to the facts of this specific case. The article paints a pretty horrifying picture.
It does.
So in October of 2022, the bodies of 6 women were found. They were found at a panel beating business in Johannesburg.
Okay.
All 6 victims, they were Zimbabwe nationals, they worked as sex workers. And tragically, they were all found bound, gagged, and strangled.
Oh.
The accused, Sifiso Mkhwanazi, he was 21 years old at the time. And even more chilling, the business where these murders took place, it belonged to his father.
Oh my God.
The article mentions that Mkhwanazi actually confessed to his father,
Wow.
admitting that he killed the women, but he insisted that it wasn't planned.
Okay.
Hearing those details, especially the brutality of the murders, and then on top of that, it happened at his father's business, it sends chills down my spine. From your experience, how do we even begin to process something like this?
It is a lot to unpack, for sure. I mean, the location, the method of the murders, his admission, but at the same time, this claim that it wasn't premeditated, it suggests potentially a very deeply disturbed psychological state.
Right.
And frankly, it raises more questions than answers.
Exactly. Because if this wasn't some random act of violence, then what could have driven him to commit such a horrific crime? And the article offers a couple of possible motives, and one was revenge.
Okay.
Apparently, Mkhwanazi had a prior accusation of rape against him.
Right.
Could these murders have been a terrifying and disturbingly calculated act of retaliation?
Yeah.
The other possibility, which his defense put forward, was a dispute over price or a fear of being arrested. But honestly, given the brutality that we've just discussed, that explanation feels paper thin. What are your thoughts on these different motives?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because the motive, this why behind these murders is where I think it gets really, really complicated. If we consider the revenge angle, it's not uncommon, particularly in cases as emotionally charged as this, for individuals who feel wronged, whether legitimately or not, to lash out, sometimes in very, very extreme ways.
Right.
However, the defense's explanation, blaming a disagreement over price or fear of arrest, That to me feels like a very classic tactic to try and shift blame, to minimize his responsibility. It's a way to dehumanize the victims and paint them as somehow complicit in their own deaths, and we see this far too often in cases of violence against women, particularly sex workers.
It's like their profession, their circumstances are being used against them, even in death. So their profession, their circumstances are being used against them, even in death, to explain away such a brutal crime.
Exactly, and that's where those deeply rooted biases we talked about, they rear their ugly heads, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to dismiss these murders as, oh, just a dispute gone wrong when you don't value the victims' lives in the first place. But, I mean, if these women weren't sex workers, if they weren't immigrants, would that explanation still hold up?
That's a really disturbing thought. We like to think justice is blind, but how often does bias, creep into these cases, coloring how the evidence is presented, how it's interpreted?
More often than I think any of us would like to admit. And this case, unfortunately, it has kind of, all the hallmarks, right? We have marginalized victims, we have a perpetrator who's attempting to deflect blame, and a defense strategy that relies on, frankly, harmful stereotypes to try to diminish his responsibility.
Like those stereotypes create this distorted lens, making it easier for society to look away from the real horror of what happened. And there's this chilling quote from the lead investigator, Bongani Mbonambi, that has really stuck with me. And he said, and I'm quoting here, the perpetrator was executing revenge against the women. Executing revenge. That phrasing, it sends chills down my spine. It speaks to a level of premeditation, of cold-blooded calculation it's hard to comprehend. And yet I can't help but think if these were 6 women from a different walk of life, would that, quote, even make headlines? Or would it be lost in the narrative, just like so much of their story?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, because it speaks to this broader issue of, whose stories get told, whose lives get mourned, and whose deaths are met with these calls for justice versus silence.
It feels like their voices are silenced twice.
Eh.
First by the brutality of their murders, and then second by a system that struggles to see them as victims deserving of our full attention, our empathy.
It's a tragic reality, and one that I think highlights this urgent need for change. We can't keep allowing these systems of oppression and bias to persist. It's not just about seeking justice for these 6 women. It's about, trying to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
So how do we even begin to dismantle these systems? What concrete steps can we take to ensure that everyone, regardless of their profession, their background, or their circumstances, feels safe, protected, and valued in South African society?
It's a multifaceted challenge, for sure, but I think it starts with just acknowledging the problem, confronting those uncomfortable truths that we've been discussing.
We can't just pay lip service to these issues.
Yeah.
We need action.
Yeah.
What would that action look like in this case? And then more broadly, when we talk about, protecting vulnerable communities.
No, you're absolutely right. We need to move beyond just talking about the problem. In the context of this case, it means challenging these narratives that dehumanize sex workers.
Okay.
It means pushing for the decriminalization of sex work, which would allow these women to operate without fear and access support systems without stigma. We also have to address the xenophobia that makes immigrant communities more vulnerable to exploitation and violence.
So it's about creating a society that's not only safer for everyone, but one that recognizes the humanity and dignity of all its members.
Precisely. And that requires, I think, a fundamental shift in how we view and treat each other.
We need to challenge our own biases, confront prejudice wherever we see it.
Absolutely. And, we can't underestimate the power of individual action. It starts with those difficult conversations, calling out discrimination and advocating for those who are marginalized and silenced.
And it means demanding better from our leaders, pushing for policies that protect the most vulnerable among us, and holding those in power accountable for creating a more just and equitable society.
It's about shifting the narrative from one of apathy and indifference to one of empathy and action.
I love that. From apathy to empathy and action, that should be our rallying cry. But it's also about remembering the human cost of these tragedies. We can't get lost in the statistics and the headlines or in the complexities of the legal system.
Right.
We need to remember that behind this case, behind those headlines, were 6 women, 6 individuals whose lives were tragically cut short.
Yeah.
They had families, they had dreams, they had hopes for the future. We can't bring them back, but we can honor their memory by fighting for a world where tragedies like this are unthinkable. A world where everyone feels safe, valued, and protected. It's easy to get caught up in the legal outcome of these things, right?
Yeah.
Like in this case, Sifiso Mkhwanazi, he was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison. Justice, at least in the eyes of law, has been served.
Right.
but it still feels like something is missing.
You've hit on such a crucial point there, because while a guilty verdict is absolutely necessary, it doesn't erase the underlying issues. Those cracks in our society that allowed this to happen in the first place.
Exactly. It doesn't bring back those women,
Eh,
and it doesn't dismantle those systems of oppression and bias that we keep talking about.
Right.
So where do we go from here?
That's the question that keeps me up at night, to be honest. It's the question we should all be asking ourselves, right? Because awareness is important,
Sure.
but it's meaningless without action.
Right.
We have to translate our outrage, our grief, into tangible change.
You're preaching to the choir here. But how do we actually do that? I mean, where do we even begin to tackle something as deep-rooted as systemic bias and violence against marginalized communities?
It's a daunting task, there's no question about it. But we can't let that, we can't let that paralyze us. I truly believe it starts with small steps, with each of us committing to doing better within our own spheres of influence, right?
So what would that look like in our everyday lives? Give us something concrete.
Yeah, so it's about having those uncomfortable conversations with our friends, with our families, with our colleagues, challenging those casual prejudices, those little offhand comments that we hear sometimes that just perpetuate harmful stereotypes. It's about educating ourselves on the issues, understanding the lived experiences of marginalized communities,
Yeah.
and amplifying their voices, right?
Being an ally, not just in words, but in action.
Exactly. And, it's about demanding better from our leaders, holding them accountable for creating a society where everyone feels safe and protected.
Yeah.
Vote for those who champion policies that protect vulnerable communities, who are actively working to address these systemic issues.
We have to be the change we want to see in the world.
Yeah,
Jenna.
that's it. We can't wait for someone else to come and fix it for us. We all have a role to play in dismantling these harmful systems.
It always comes back to that word you used earlier, empathy. We need to see each other, truly see each other, and recognize, I think, the shared humanity that binds us.
If we can do that, if we can start from a place of empathy and understanding, then maybe, just maybe, we can create a world where tragedies like this become unthinkable.
A world where everyone, regardless of their profession, their background, their circumstances, can walk through life with dignity, with respect, and knowing that their lives matter. And all 6 of those women, they mattered. Their stories matter, and it's up to us to ensure that their lives and their deaths weren't in vain. And that's what really I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, that sense of responsibility, that call to action. Because silence in the face of injustice is simply not an option.